Hi, I'm Jen Best from Beaker Button, and this is part 3 of how to make a Dorset knob. So this is doing your stitching around the top, and it's a detached blanket stitch, but you need to put some anchor stitches in first. So this is the fabric covered mould that we did earlier, and we've got our thread still attached, and we're going to do a range of, or a circle rather, of blanket stitches all the way round. So you're going to put your needle in and bring it out a little way towards the edge. Make sure the thread goes underneath the needle and then pull through. Again, take it nice and slowly so you can pull out any knots that form. And that's your first one. You don't have to pull too tight. Your next one moves round to the right a little, making sure that the thread goes underneath the needle and then pull through. And again, so you're sort of doing little segments all the way around. I'm just putting my thumb over the top of the stitch when I pull because it helps to just keep the thread from tangling a little bit. I'm working my way around, so close at the bottom of the stitch to the last one, a little bit further away at the top. That's a little bit far out. I'm going to come in here and the thread's underneath the needle. This is blanket stitch. I'm just going to move my needle down my thread a little bit. Try and keep it fairly even all the way around. And if you're starting to get more tangles, you probably need to untwist the thread. So if you hold the needle up and just let the just let the mould drop, it'll take out any extra twist. You'll need to do that fairly frequently when we start doing the stitching around in a minute. I'm just going to lift that stitch over that fold of fabric so it's not sitting underneath. Okay. Catches down over the top. So Dorset knobs are a really interesting button. They were supposedly designed or invented by Thomas Clayton, who was the chap who turned the Dorset button industry into a cottage industry. He was employed by the Cases firm to modernise things in the 1700s, and he started getting people to make the buttons in their houses instead of coming into factories, and then became a piecework thing. He'd visited the Moores factory, which Moores make biscuits, and he'd fallen in love with the shape of the Moores Dorset knob, decided he needed a button like it, and so these were born. Queen Victoria apparently had Dorset knobs on one of her dresses. I'm just going to let some of that twist out again. You can see it spinning round there, just let some of the slack out. I like them because they're so they're different and they're interesting to make, and they make good buttons, but they're also very good for adding texture to textile work or decorations, and something a little bit different to do. As you get back round, I've got a couple more stitches to do. So I'm making my stitches quite far apart because I want you to be able to see what I'm doing. But if you're doing a small button, a delicate button, you can do them closer together. So this is the stitch that I started with. So I'm just going to tuck the needle underneath and pull through and pull tight, and that finishes off that blanket stitch. Now at this point you're going to want to change needles if you're at all fiddly with your fingers. So I tend to do this next bit with a blunt needle rather than a sharp one, because we're going to do a detached blanket stitch all the way round, and you don't want to catch the fabric. So I'm turning it round. These are my blanket stitches, these are my anchor stitches. I've got the thread off to the left and the needle comes under that first blanket stitch and over the thread and pull through, and that's your first stitch. You don't need to pull it tight, you want a little bit of a loop to show. And then the next one comes into the next stitch, so you're going underneath the stitch and then over the thread and pull. Keep that thread between your fingers as you're working round. So as I pull, see, I'm not pulling tight, I'm leaving a little bit of a loop. And just catch the next one, and you're going to work your way all around. Turning it and keeping it tight as you're going. So you want to place the stitch and then hold the thread. So you get that loop, and then you're pulling your little, you're sort of making a little mesh, and you're going to keep the mesh going towards the top of the button by holding that thread. And you're working all the way around. This is basically it. So I'm going to get round to the start of the round and then show you where to go next. But rather than watching me stitching all the time, underneath and over the tail. I'm going to do a Blue Peter thing and say, here's one I prepared earlier. So I'm just going to catch that little bit of thread where it's catching underneath. So you want something that's strong to make these buttons with, something that doesn't have a lot of stretch. And when I get back to the start, there's my first stitch. Always a little bit twisted, but it's just there. So instead of going into the anchor stitch, I'm going to go into that first stitch, but you're still doing that detached buttonhole, detached blanket stitch rather, all the way around. And you just keep going. So I'm keeping that mesh by pulling the tail between my fingers each time, pulling it up towards the top so it doesn't curl back on itself, to keep it under a little bit of tension. And you can see how the mesh starts to form. So I'll just keep doing that until we get to the top, and pop that to one side, and then here's is one I prepared earlier. So you can see I've gone all the way around. As you get towards the top, the stitches get smaller and smaller, and you're just working into each of those stitches. And I've changed to the sharp needle again just for the last few stitches. So I'm going to do the last one, and that closes that little gap that's left. And I'm just going to pass the needle over the opposite stitch through the centre of the button to the back. I tend to use the table to push it down, and then that closes the hole, and you get that nice little mesh around the outside. You can either use this tail to sew it on if you want to, or you can make yourself a shank. So wherever you've come out, come across the button and make a stitch. Leave a little loop. I'm leaving myself a little loop there. And then do the same again, so I'm coming across the same place and leave the same loop. So you've got 2 loops of thread, and then you're just going to do a blanket stitch all the way around the outside. So I'm going to come here and pull that tight. So I'm coming through the loop, pick up the thread and pull it tight through the loop and pull tight. You can see how you start to get a bit of a shank forming. All the way around. Until you get to the other side of the shank. I'm just going to do that last stitch in there. And that gives you something to sew your button on with. And then finish it off just by passing the needle through the button a couple of times and trim it off. And there we have our Dorset buttons. Thank you for watching, hope you've enjoyed it. If you have a look at www.beakerbutton.co.uk, and you'll see all sorts of kits and threads and rings and needles and various other things all for your button making. Thank you for watching.